Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today we're going to turn a Christmas gnome. These Christmas gnomes are a really fun project because they use a lot of scrap material you have lying around your shop, and there really aren't a lot of expensive tools or fixtures you need to turn them. For this piece, this was a cracked piece of cedar I found in the trash can, and then this was a spalted piece of maple that had a big check in the end that I couldn't really use for any other projects. So for something like this, it's really fun to use, kind of your trash wood to get started. Before we start turning our Christmas gnome, we want to talk about different sizes of gnomes and the material you're going to need. The great thing about this project is it is scalable, so if you want, you can turn a larger one like this for a tabletop, and you can do a few for a set, or you can scale them really small and do them as more of like a hanging type ornament. So it is really dependent on the type of material you have in your shop, or that you can get access to. But for this demo, I'm going to be turning a little bit larger type because I like having a good trio I can put on my table in my house. And I think this size is really good. And the other thing too is you don't need to turn them all the exact same size. Having a few of different sizes gives you some variety as far as displaying them and different material choices as well. So I'm going to set these over here. And the first thing we're going to want to do when we start turning our gnome is we're going to select the wood for the body. This is a piece of spalted maple that's got some wormholes in it. This is kind of a junker piece of wood just because it has a bunch of holes in there that you could fill if you needed to. But this will be a good size to start for the body. To do a gnome roughly this size, I'm going to start out with a 3x3 by 4.5 roughly. Obviously you can scale it depending on what you want to have as your finish size. But this will give us a good starting size for the body. And the first thing we're going to want to do is mount this between centers and turn ourselves a tenon for our chuck so we can hold it a little more securely. On the chuck right now, I've got a VM100. This is a 3.5-inch chuck. And if I open this up all the way, I'm not going to be able to fit this block inside the chuck jaws just due to the size of the chuck. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to grab my 4-prong drive center and I'm going to mount it directly in the chuck. And I'm going to use the jaws to hold on to it. All I got to do is make sure that the 4-prong drive center is square up against the inside of the chuck jaws and make sure that's nice and straight before I lock it down. And then that way I can use the 4-prong plus the spur to drive the block, and then I'll use my revolving center for support. I like doing it this way just so I don't have to remove the chuck as soon as I get a tenon on there. It's pretty time intensive when you're adding a chuck, taking it off, putting it back on. This just speeds up the process, being able to mount it in there. If I was turning a larger piece, I wouldn't use this method just because this isn't as secure as putting it in the Morse taper. But for a small piece like this, where all we're going to be doing is turning a tenon on one side, it'll work out just fine. And as far as finding the center on a piece like this, because it's not dimensionally important as far as what our finish size is, I'm going to eyeball it. So what I'll do is I'll rough eyeball the center and I'll use the tailstock cone and I'll just press it in there and that'll give me a rough center mark. And that's all I need there. I'll flip it over and do the same thing. And after you do this a bunch of times, you get a fairly good idea of where the center of a piece is. If you had a jig, you could mark it out. It just depends on what you'd like to do. But for me, because I know I'm going to be removing a lot of material here to get to our finish size, I'm not concerned with losing some material that way. So I've got it mounted up against the 4-prong on this end, and then I'm going to bring up my tailstock for the extra support we need. Make sure your tailstock's locked down there. And then I'm going to snug up my quill. My tailstock's good to go. And then we're going to go ahead and adjust our tool rests. Just going to give this a little turn by hand, and you can see it hit the tool rest there, so that means I need to back it off just a little bit. And then I'm going to grab my spindle roughing gouge and just check the height of my tool rest. I want this with the handle down at my waist to be roughly right about center. And I think that should be okay. So give it one more spin real quick just to make sure everything clears. and then we can go ahead and turn on our lathe. Obviously, make sure you wear eye pro, and if you want, you can wear a dust mask as well. So once everything's secured here, we can go ahead and turn this on. And as far as our speed goes, I'm right around 2400 RPM. You could turn faster if you like, but for the roughing process, I'm going to keep it around 2400 RPM due to the size of the piece. And we're going to go ahead and start roughing off the corners on one half of the blank, and then we're going to turn our tenon so we can put it into a chuck and have a more secure fit. So for the spindle roughing gouge, I've got the flute in about the 2 o'clock position here, and I've got the handle down at my waist. And then I'm going to start just doing some small peeling cuts here from the center towards the end. One thing, especially with the spindle roughing gouges, you want to make sure that's anchored on the tool rest before you start the cut. I've had it before where the tool will be off the tool rest a little bit and it'll catch the piece and smack into the tool rest, and sometimes it'll pinch your finger, so you want to be careful that way. Make sure you're anchored on the tool rest, and then go ahead and start taking some small cuts, removing these corners. And you always want to cut from large diameter to small. If you try and cut backwards, it'll skate up the piece and it'll dig in a little bit. Again, I've got that flute at about the 2 o'clock, 1 o'clock position here. If I go in with that flute in the 12 o'clock position, it might have a tendency to catch my left edge here and roll that tool in and lead to a catch. So I'm just paring this down to where I can get my skew into a peel cut and give myself a tenon for the chuck. So I'm going to set that down, and I'm going to use my skew, and for actually what I'm going to do before I make my tenon, I'm going to adjust my tool rest slightly. I'm going to angle that just a little bit in here, make sure that still clears. And what I'm going to be doing is it's a peel cut with my skew. So I'm going to start with the handle really low. It's going to start with the bevel riding, and then I'm going to lift the handle. And this is a really efficient cut for spindle turning. This removes a lot of material really quickly. A great way to do your tenons. And as far as my tenon size is concerned, the best grip I'm going to have is when the jaws are close to being all the way closed, roughly 1/8 of an inch open from being completely closed. So I'm gonna eyeball it here. I don't have to be exact. If you're doing this a lot, it wouldn't hurt to have a little jig made to where you can just mark it up there and get the exact size every time. But again, peel cut, start with the handle low, ride that bevel, and then start the cut. So based on the jaws, I've got the standard 2.5 inch dovetail jaws on here. Or actually they're a 2 inch, I believe. Make sure this edge is nice and flat. And then I like to chamfer the bottom of the tenon just a little bit. So on the bottom of the tenon here, I like to just roll that sharp corner off. I don't like sharp edges on those, as well as the chuck jaws tend to compress those a little bit too much. So I like to turn that off there. But what we can do now is, I know this will fit in the chuck jaws, so we're going to take this off the lathe. I'm going to get my chuck key, and we're going to remove the 4-prong drive center. I'm actually going to set this aside. And now we can go ahead and mount this in our chuck jaws. So if these jaws were completely closed, you can see they're about 1/4 of an inch open right there. So I will have some compression rings, but most of this back here is actually going to be wasted wood, so I'm not worried about crushing my tenon because I'm not going to be remounting it with this tenon later. If it was a project where you were going to be reusing this block after, you'd want that as close to a perfect circle with your jaws as possible. That way you could reuse it and it would center up pretty well for you. So I'm just going back and forth with the 2 different pinion gears on both sides, making sure it's snug. A lot of times if you tighten up one side, you don't get the full mechanical advantage of the pinion gears. So just make sure you go on both sides, tighten everything up by hand. And then we'll bring up our tailstock for support. And you can see if you have a good tenon on there as well, because our center point should line up with the revolving center, and looks like that's good to go. So as we rough this down, I'm going to keep my tailstock in place. You always want to use your tailstock whenever it's possible. So now we're going to bring up our tool rest. Give that a quick spin, make sure everything fits. This just needs to be hand tight. You don't have to crank on it. If you get a little too excessive with the pressure on this, it has a tendency to split, being a 60-degree cone. So depending on your material, obviously, snug is all you need there. Snug on the quill, make sure your tool rest is locked down and everything's solid before you turn on the lathe. So we're going to turn this back on. I'm going to bump the speed up a little bit now that we're in a chuck. I have a more secure hold than I did on the 4-prong drive. So I'm going to bump this up a little bit. We're about 2,700 RPM. And we're going to go back to our spindle roughing gouge. This is a 3/4 spindle roughing gouge. One of the most used tools in a Woodturner's toolbox. And again, we're going to start on the end, and we're just going to start peeling off this material here. And remember, I've got that flute in about a 1 o'clock position coming up this way. And the nice thing about a spindle roughing gouge is it's used primarily to remove stock. It's really good at removing a lot of wood really quickly. That's why it's one of the most used tools in a Woodturner's toolbox. Really good tool. It stays sharp fairly long. Obviously, if you can feel a change in your cut, go ahead and hit the grinder. You can see on the overhead camera, I've got my thumb over the flute. The reason I do that is because I don't like the chips flying up straight into my shirt and down my collar. So I use my thumb as basically kind of a chip deflector. That helps guide the shavings down the flute and down away from my face. Occasionally you might get a splinter in the end of your thumb. It doesn't happen very often at all, and to me it's worth the risk. And right now I'm just going to try and make this cylinder completely round, and that'll give us a good idea as far as what our diameter is going to be for the piece that we're working with. So I put my tool on top of the wood, and you can see how that's bouncing. That means there's a flat spot on the piece. If I stop the lathe, you can see I've got a big flat spot there and a small one there, and I'm going to keep going until this is completely round. As soon as I get close to the chuck, I'm going to roll the tool over and start cutting towards the chuck. Obviously, you want to be very careful where your tool is in relation to the chuck, because if you hit the chuck with it, it's going to kick the tool out of your hand, or you could have a more serious problem. So you want to be very careful. So if you're going really fast out here and you start cutting towards the chuck, just slow it down. Be a little more careful with these cuts over here, because you don't want to hit your jaws, because you might break your tool or have a big nick in the jaws themselves. So now I'm just checking over here by the chuck. I can still feel a little bit of a flat spot with my finger, and I'm going to go ahead and keep removing material. Okay, if I put the tool on there now, that's good and flat, but I've got one little flat spot right here. Again, you want to be very mindful of where the jaws are. And then now that I'm round, I'm going to go across this fairly slow of a feed rate. That'll allow me to get a nice clean surface on here to see what we're working with. Alright, we're going to stop the lathe and take a look and see what we have. So I'm going to go ahead and try and turn this body to be roughly the same length as the gnome I have here. So the one nice thing about gnomes is there's no exact size. You have to have, like you do on a pepper mill, where you have to be very exact to your dimensions. That's one nice thing about these projects, is it's just eyeball it. Okay, roughly overall it's that long. I've got to square this much off here, so that's all going to be removed, and that's good enough. That's all you need. So when you turn a lot of pepper mills and you have to be exact to your overall length and dimensions, it gets a little tiring. So doing something fun and a little whimsical like this is kind of fun to do because you don't have to be exacting. So this is going to be the bottom of the gnome. And this is going to give us a nice flat bottom here. We have a slightly concave piece here. And then on the inside of this that the hat is attached to is going to be we're going to drill a hole for a tenon on the hat. So if I grab one of these other gnomes, so what we're going to be working with is a tenon on the hat and then just a drilled recess on the body itself. So what we want to do now is I'm going to go ahead and remove the tailstock, and we're going to square this end up and slightly concave it, and then we're going to drill a hole for the hat tenon. And actually, yeah, I think my tool rest was okay where it was. I can't get much further with the size of the tool rest. So because I have my mark here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a parting tool just to give me the visual reference so I don't turn it away like the pencil mark. And then I'm actually going to remove some of this with the skew with a peel cut. Handle low, start with that bevel riding a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and raise the handle. And what we can do now before we actually square this off and give us a good clean surface is we can rough shape the body. So for this gnome, I've got the body tapering towards where the hat is with a slightly wider base than the top. And that's what we're going to try and shoot for. I'll turn that there so you can see the profile we're going to shoot for. So this end's going to be the hat, this end's going to be the bottom. And we're using the spindle roughing gouge. If you want to, you can get your 1/2-inch spindle gouge, ride the bevel, it'll give you just a little bit cleaner of a cut. I'm going to start working this down here. And on these cuts where I'm rolling and I'm creating a nice rounded edge, I find it, for me, I like to put my finger in the flute here, and it gives me a nice steady anchoring point to roll the tool over and give me a little more control with the spindle gouge. And it gives me a nice smooth radius. So that's something that might work out for you. But I'm going to go ahead and use the spindle roughing gouge just because it's a little faster. The other cool thing about these gnomes is the shape and of the body and the hat are completely up to whatever you want to do. There's no shape that has to be exactly the same. So you might find you want to do a squattier body, a little bit wider at the base and really narrow at the top, or fairly uniform. You know, play around with different shapes. Every gnome's going to be a little different. So play around with the different shapes and see what you like. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use my spindle gouge to remove some of this waste material here to give me a little more clearance for my tool. So I'm just going to roll a 1/2 bead here. That way if I rub my finger against it while I'm cutting, I don't have a sharp edge there. See, now I've got myself some clearance, and if I rub my knuckle into it while I'm making a cut, it's not going to be sharp. I'm going to use my parting tool and give me just a little bit of a gap there between the waste material. And right now, we just want to rough shape the body, because once we remount this on our tenon, that's when we'll get our finished shape and we'll sand it and get that finished profile we need. This is just a rough shape while we're in the chuck, and it'll be a little more secure that way. So if I eyeball the horizon of what I have on this one, it's a little more narrow than what I have here, so I'm going to just remove a little bit more material. I don't normally turn right-handed, so that's a little interesting. There we go. That bevel riding cut with the spindle gouge gives us a nice clean cut there, you can see. So you can see the spindle roughing gouge leaves you a little bit of tear out across this face, and then this is with the spindle gouge, gives you a nice clean surface. So now that we have our rough profile out, what we can do is we're going to use the spindle gouge to square this up and slightly give us a concave surface. That way when the hat and the body meet together, if there's any proud areas in there, there's a little more room for them to fit together and not have a gap around the hat and the body. So we want a nice fit in there. You can see I've got a little bit of a concave fit on the hat as well as the body. That just ensures everything goes together a little more smooth. So I'm going to remove the the tailstock here, get this out of the way, and we're going to use our spindle gouge. We're going to go in here, and this will give us a nice clean cut. We're going to start with that flute closed, and then we're going to arc a little bit towards center, and that'll give us a nice clean cut. So I'm going to move that out of the way a little further, and just bring that tool rest in just a little closer. And anytime you're working on the end here and you're trying to square up the end of a blank, you want to make sure you start the cut with that flute completely closed over. So the center of the flute is pointed basically 3 o'clock to me. That ensures that this doesn't skate back across the surface. If I go in here with just a little bit open, it's going to catch and it'll skate up the work. So start with that closed until you're on the bevel, and then you can open it up a little bit and then make that cut. So you can see through that cutting process, I start with the handle basically flat. Once I'm on a bevel, I open that flute and I drop the handle, which brings the tip of the tool up a little bit, and then I make my cut, and then I arc it back towards the center point as we're making the cut. So I'm going to start with the flute closed. I open the flute a little bit, I drop the handle, I raise it, and then that tip goes back to the center point. So you can see the nice thing about it being a bevel riding cut is you're cutting into side grain here across the end grain. So you're cutting side grain and it leaves a really clean surface. So I can tell just from looking at it, it's got a little bit of a high point in the center. I want this to be concave. I want to have a little bit of a dish to it, so that way when those parts fit together, I don't have any gaps. And the best way to accomplish that is I start there, I can start right here on the edge, and I can swing the handle away from my body a little bit, which is going to point the bevel of the tool towards the center, and that'll give me a nice concave area, and then I can swing the handle back. So if you watch the tip of the tool, I start here, I open the flute, swing the handle away from me, and then back towards my body. And then now if you look at it, we have a nice concave surface. If I hold the tool up there, we've got about a 1/16 or so from the center point to the tool. So that's a really good surface there. I'm not going to bother sanding it right now. This is something that'll never be seen unless you take it apart. So if you want to, you can sand it, but I'm just going to leave it as is. The next thing we need to do now is we're going to want to go ahead and drill the hole for the hat tenon. Now this one's glued together. Let me see. So what we're going to want to do now is we're going to drill the hole for the hat tenon. I found a 1/2 inch drill bit is a good size because we're going to be turning a tenon to fit into here to remount this, and a 1/2 inch is a good size. If you go any smaller than that, the tenon for holding the workpiece is a little weak. You could go bigger if you want. If you want to drill a 3/4 hole, and then we'll be turning a 3/4 tenon, that works as well. 1/2 inch, that's just the bit I had closest to me, and it works for what we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our revolving center. Get my keyless chuck. Make sure there's no debris on the Morse taper. That way when you seat it in there, it seats securely. And then I've got just a 1/2 inch twist bit. And before I drill this, I'm going to use my skew and give myself a little bit of a dimple for that drill bit to register on. So I'm just using the lead corner. Just a tiny little dimple there. That'll help that bit seat in the center. And I'm going to bring my tailstock up here with the drill chuck, and I'm going to drop the lathe speed down. Anytime you're drilling on the lathe like this, you want to slow your lathe speed down a ways. I'm at about 1,000 RPM here. That's pretty good. And I'm just going to snug up my quill just a little bit. A lot of times quills will have enough play in the system to where if this is loose enough for it to go back and forth, you have slop in there and that causes that bit to wander a little bit. So I'm going to snug that up just a bit. Enough to where I can still advance the tailstock, or sorry, the quill, but not too tight to where it'll lock it in. So go ahead and start the bit. And I'm going to go in there about an inch. An inch will give me plenty of room to have, make sure my tenon length is long enough that it'll be secure when I remount it, as well as give me a little more clearance room for glue or anything else I might need. Last thing you want to do is drill that too shallow, then go to mount it on your tenon and you only have a 3/8 drilled hole in there and then you're kind of stuck with it. So now that we have this drilled, the end here is concave, we have our rough profile. I'm going to go ahead and remove my keyless chuck, and we're going to go ahead and part the body of the gnome off this piece. Once this is parted off, we're going to turn our remaining piece in the chuck down into a tenon that we can then remount it with. So bump the speed back up, 2,700 RPM. I'm going to use my parting tool. Whenever you're using a parting tool, you want to make sure the width of the cut is wider than the blade, otherwise it'll bind up as it goes down and it could catch. Definitely heats up. You can see the end of the blade there's a little hot from something I did before. So you want to make sure that the cut you're making is at least, 1.5 times wider than the blade. And then what I'll do is I'll make a cut and then I'll go over just a tiny bit, make another cut and kind of step it as it goes down. That way I'm not binding up on the blade. And what you can do is once you get down to about 1/4 inch of material holding the body on, you can hold the parting tool with one hand, support the piece that's going to be parted off with the other hand just loosely, and then you can go ahead and part that off and then catch it. If you grip it too tight, obviously you might grab it too hard. You don't want to do that. Just loose enough that it can spin in your hand as you part it off and then you catch it. So you can see we have a nice concave surface here that's ready to remount with a 1-inch deep hole, and then now we're going to go ahead and turn a tenon here that we can mount this onto. So I'm going to be using our skew as a peeling cut to turn a tenon for this, and I'm going to adjust my tool rest just a little bit. I want to get my tool rest as close to the workpiece as possible. The further away you are, the more leverage there is on the tool. And anytime you can have that as close as possible, the better. So again, a peeling cut, I start with the handle low. I'm going to be rubbing that bevel and then I'll slowly raise the handle, dropping the cutting edge into the piece, and it'll go ahead and peel all that side grain away. And what I'm looking for is basically a 1/2 inch long to 5/8 long tenon. That'll give me a nice secure hold for this. And because I know this is a 1/2 inch hole because we used a 1/2 inch bit, I'm going to go ahead and just eyeball close to a 1/2 inch and then we'll test the fit of the tenon. The other thing too is I want to make sure that this shoulder here is nice and flat or slightly concave. If it's convex, that piece will be rocking on there and won't have a nice square shoulder to register off of. So we'll start the cut again, bevel riding, raise the handle. And this is probably 3/4 here, so I'm going to go ahead and keep peeling that down. And what you can do too, depending on the length of your skew, if that's getting too far over the rest, you can go ahead and bring this up just a little bit. The one thing with this material for being used as a tenon, it is pretty soft. I'd prefer something a little bit harder than what this is. Considering that it's spalted, it's fairly soft. So it will tear out a little bit on a peel cut. I'm gonna go ahead and work this down. A good way for testing the fit of your tenon is you can give yourself a tapered shoulder. So I'll show you here. I'm actually gonna use my spindle gouge for this. So if you have enough material for it, give yourself a slight taper. And what you can do is you can get the piece while the lathe is spinning, set it up against there, and you can see it'll leave you a small burned line. That's our new diameter. That's the inside edge of that drilled hole. And that gives you a good visual reference for making your tenon the right size. The other thing you could do too is if you have a set of calipers, that's a good way to quickly check it. Bunch of different ways for making that process quicker. I prefer the burnish method just because I know exactly what the hole diameter size is. Depending on your material, just because you used a 1/2 inch bit doesn't mean the hole's going to be exactly a half. Softer woods will drill a little bit oversized sometimes, so the tapered burnish method gives me the exact size of this piece, and for me is a little more accurate. So now I'm going to go ahead and part the rest of this down. Slightly proud of that burnish mark. And I want that tenon to be as straight as I can, maybe have a little bit of a larger diameter right in the middle, because with all this being side grain, that grain's running this direction, when you go to press your the gnome body on, it will compress those fibers down. So if it's a little oversized, usually that's okay, but I can see I'm still just a hair too large to fit the body there. So let's go ahead and taper this down just a little bit. You could also use your spindle gouge if you wanted to. That'll give you a little bit of a cleaner surface. Go ahead and check that fit again. So you can see it looks like it's going on there, and you can see how it's turning shiny where it's compressed those fibers to press into here. That's what I'm looking for. I want to compress those fibers a little bit because I know I'm going to get a good fit. When I go and turn that, you hear that snapping noise? Those are the fibers breaking loose as they're compressing a little bit against the piece. And that gives me a really good surface to register against. The other thing too is this face is slightly concave to where I'm registering on the outside diameter of the body, which is really good. That's what I'm looking for. I mean, you can see this piece is running really true, considering working with a really soft material. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and remove some of the material here, give myself some more working room, and then we're going to go ahead and refine the curve that we have here and get our finished curve. Once we have our finished curve established, I'm going to go ahead and square off the bottom, and I'm going to give myself a small foot. I like having a little bit of a foot on the bottom of this. It's kind of like a soda can. It raises the piece off the table, gives it a little more elevation to it, makes it look a little more professional that way as well, instead of being completely flat on the bottom and just resting on the table. So that little bit of a step there gives it a little better look. So go ahead and start roughing this down. If you want to, you could definitely bring up the tailstock for support. If your fit wasn't very tight with the tenon, I would throw another piece in there and get a better fit on a new piece of wood if your tenon was loose at all. I'm going to use the spindle gouge just to roll this over a little bit here. That way I've got more clearance for my tools and my sandpaper, as well as it'll get rid of any sharp edges I have here, so I don't have to worry about hitting my knuckles. I'm going to get my spindle gouge, my spindle roughing gouge. I'm going to go ahead and refine the curve I've got. And I want to be fairly gentle. It's only a 1/2 inch tenon, so you want to be fairly gentle with it. If you get too aggressive with it, you will probably snap the tenon off. You can hear there as I'm getting out here on the end, I'm getting a little bit of chatter. That's because that tenon's flexing a little bit, so what I'm doing is I'm putting my hand behind the piece to help support it a little bit as I make that cut. What you could do is you could bring up the tailstock right now because a lot of this will be turned away, so we don't have to worry about a dimple or anything from the cup center. And because we're turning up against a piece of wood here, I'm going to use the spindle gouge, and I'm going to use the tip of the tool to get in there to make this cut. The other nice thing too is it is a bevel riding cut, so it gives me a nice clean surface. Okay, I like that shape. Now we're ready to go ahead and start turning the bottom of this. And because I'm not supported by the tailstock, I want to be very gentle with the amount of pressure I'm using on the tool. Again, I've got that tool closed over completely as I start the cut. I'm getting a little bit of vibration there. I'm actually going to bring up my tool rest right now because I'm getting more vibration than I expected out of this piece. So I'm going to use that while I rough turn the foot. And you can see that brought me out of square just a little bit, bringing that tool rest in. That'll be okay. The wood I'm working with is really soft. And I want to make sure that the bottom of this is concave. If it's not concave and the wood moves at all, it's going to rock on your table. So you want to make sure that this is slightly concave. I'm going to re-true this up because it did move a little bit after I brought the center up. I'm going to use my skew as a peel cut to give me that nice little foot. It's getting a little grabby just because the handle on this is really short. So if it's doing that to you, you can go ahead and grab a full-size skew. And now that I have that step there, I'm going to go ahead and use my spindle gouge to clean up those cuts I made with the skew, because that peel cut's not going to give me a super clean surface. And I'm actually going to go to a 3/8 spindle gouge. This has more of a, I think like a 35-degree bevel on it. It'll give me just a little more clearance to get in there, both directions, and make the cut. And anytime that you can do a bevel riding cut, it'll cut cleaner for you. Again, you want to make sure you start that cut with the flute completely closed, otherwise it'll skate on you and you're going to have a bunch of catch marks up the face of this here. So we can stop and see how clean we're cutting. Okay, I've got a really good surface here. That honestly could be sanded with probably 400 there. The bottom is really clean. And the body is pretty clean. There is some chatter from when that piece was wobbling around a little bit before I brought the tailstock up. So what I want to do now is I want to make sure this is nice and clean. And then I'm going to go ahead and remove the tailstock and get rid of the nub in the bottom of the piece. And then we can sand it. I can see a little bit of a mirage on the top horizon of the piece here. That means that the piece isn't true. I'm getting some high and low spots around the piece. And you can feel it too. If the piece isn't perfectly centered or is shifted, you can feel it out around. So we're going to go ahead and remove the nub on the bottom here. And I want to make this a little more concave than it currently is. And then I'm going to go in and try and remove and make that as small as possible while the tailstock's in place. because I don't want to break those end grain fibers out right there. And you could see as soon as I got to the bottom of that nub, the tailstock stopped spinning. That meant I had cut through the piece and it was no longer being driven and driving the tailstock. So I cut that nub off. We can stop the lathe and take a look and see what we have. But I could tell I had a little bit of some compression rings here, and that's caused by me pushing the bevel too hard into the end grain, and it's pushing the tool and compressing those fibers. But that sounds out really clean. That's not too bad. Sometimes it can be worse. But I've got a nice clean surface here. That shoulder with a little bit of a step is nice and clean, and we can go ahead and start sanding this. The outside of the body here does have a little bit of tear out. We also have these wormholes that give it some cool character as well. We'll sand out a little bit. But what we'll do is I'm going to start out with, let's see what I've got here, 180. 180, this is a clean enough surface to do 180. If it was any worse, I'd start out with 120 or 80. So I'm going to drop the speed down for sanding. A lot of times if you sand at your full turning speed, it's going to get too hot. You can melt your paper, or you can have heat checking, depending on your material. The other thing too is when it's turning too fast, the sandpaper isn't cutting efficiently. And it makes your sandpaper wear out faster than it should. So keeping that heat under control while you're sanding is extremely important. General rule of thumb is if the paper is getting too hot for you to hold, you're being too aggressive or your speed's too high. A lot of the exotic materials, if you sand them and they get too hot, they'll check on you because of the heat. You think about the wood going from 65, 70 degrees in here to being sanded and it's all of a sudden 200 degrees. That wood doesn't like that rapid heat expansion. So I'm actually going to get rid of my tool rest because it's in the way. I'm going to slide my tailstock out of the way a little bit. And we're just sanding the end here, trying to get rid of any of those compression rings. Obviously you want to make sure you're wearing a dust mask when you're sanding and turning. We don't in these videos just for the audio's sake. The microphones don't pick up our voice very well when we're wearing a mask, so I'm going to stop the lathe and see how the surface is looking. Okay, we got rid of all the tear out. The only thing on the surface now are the sanding scratches, so we can go ahead and go to a finer grit. So we started at 180. I'd go 180, 220, 320. If you want to go higher than that, go ahead. And then for this little shoulder in there, you can fold the paper over, use the corner to sand it, but we cut it really clean, so I'm not too concerned about it. All right. Go ahead and inspect the surface. If you have sanding scratches that are visible, go ahead and sand those out. But it looks pretty good. We've got a nice concave surface here on the bottom. We have our shoulder. That'll give us that little bit of elevation here we're looking for. I'm happy with the shape. So we're going to go ahead and finish this piece for the body as it is. As far as the finishing process on this goes, I like to have more of a satin close to the wood type finish. So what I'm going to use is a sanding sealer that I've cut 50-50 with lacquer thinner. So 50% lacquer thinner, 50% Mylan's sanding sealer. That's going to give me a good base. It'll help protect the wood, and then we're going to use just scratch free on the top of that to refine the surface and give us a nice satin finish. If you wanted to have something a little higher gloss, you could definitely use like a spray lacquer, or you could use any of the shellac based finishes that are like a friction polish type. If this was going to be a hanging ornament, I'd probably go glossier to make it pop, stand out of the tree. But for a tabletop piece, I like the more satin look. So what I'm going to do is I'll get a little bit of paper towel, fold that over, and I'm gonna go ahead and liberally pour my sanding sealer. So go ahead and coat this. Make sure that you sealed all the wood fibers. The reason I cut my sanding sealer 50-50 with lacquer thinner is the sanding sealer out of the bottle is more of a syrupy consistency, and it doesn't penetrate into the wood fibers like I'd like it to. So having this cut down to where more of a water thickness allows it to run into the wood fibers and get a lot further penetration and seal everything up a little better. So once I've done that, I'm gonna go ahead, set my rag off to the side because we'll reuse it later. Obviously, be careful with your flammable rags. Put those in the proper container to dispose them, but we will be using this later. So now that this is completely saturated, I'm gonna go ahead and get a clean piece of paper towel, and we're gonna basically friction dry this. Because there's a lot of lacquer thinner in this, it dries pretty quickly. And you can see as it's drying, it's actually getting shinier and shinier, which is why we're going to be using scratch-free after, because it will cut some of that gloss. All right, so once the piece isn't tacky anymore, I'm going to go ahead and get my jar of scratch-free. This is about 1,000 to 2,000 paste wax. Sorry, 1,000 to 2,000 grit paste wax. And I've got a fair amount on the rag here, and I'm going to go ahead and start applying some pressure. That pressure is going to melt the wax and allow the grit to start polishing and tumbling across the surface and refining that, as well as cutting some of that gloss down. So I've got a really nice satin sheen. I'm going to do the same to the end and that shoulder as well. One thing I found is I'll use my fingernail underneath the rag to get into the corner there, or you could fold it over and try and push that up into there. And then we can go ahead and stop the lathe and take a look. So I can see I've got some streaky areas where the sanding sealer didn't get removed. So I'm going to go ahead and start this again. Get a little more paste wax. I'm going to use just a little bit more pressure to try and remove those little high spots. The other thing you could do too is if you have some steel wool, those will knock that down really fast. There we go. We got a nice satin finish there, nice and uniform. The other thing I like about this too is it doesn't darken the wood. It gives it a nice natural appearance, doesn't have dark spots or light spots. Really good stuff. I'm going to go ahead and remove this from the tenon now, and we'll use our rag and put some more of the sanding sealer on there. And we're going to go ahead and just seal the end grain here where the hat's going to mount. I don't want to use any of the paste wax inside the drilled hole because that'll prevent the hat from being able to glue in and give us a good bond. So that's why I'm only using sanding sealer on the end here. So now we have our body. You can see what it's going to look like compared to this one. So now that we've got this one turned, we're ready to turn the hat. As far as turning the hat goes, I like to pick a contrasting material from what I turned the body out of. So like on this one, we used some spalted maple, and then this is actually Eastern red cedar that I used a torch on to darken it up because I had some torn out areas that were part of the natural bark inclusions there. So I burned them to make them look a little cooler as far as the hat goes. So for the hat, I like the, what is this? Piece of myrtle. The myrtle's not going to contrast as much as the cedar will, but I still think it'll give us a good look to it. Myrtle is a really nice turning material. The other thing you could do too as well is if you want to get some dye out, you could color the hat or the body independently. I think as far as the overall height of this, I think that should work out pretty good. You could go taller or shorter on the hat depending on what you have. I kind of like the little bit taller hats. But you can play around with the different sizes as well. Like we've got this guy here. This is all one piece actually. We didn't turn the hat separate. We did it all one piece and did a small little top hat on the guy. And it looks pretty cool too. So, and he's got more of a mustache. But as far as the hat goes, We're going to go ahead and turn it out of that piece of myrtle. Those are about the same. Okay, and so the cool thing now is now that we have this jig here, you can go ahead and keep this for other projects down the road because you already have a tenon on there. If you're going to plan on remounting it, you can mark which jaw you took it out of so you can remount it the exact same way every time. Just taking a look here to see if there's any inclusions that I want to remove. If I had a big check over here in the corner, this would be the top of the hat because I'm going to be turning such a small point. This piece looks pretty solid actually. So just like we turned the body, I'm going to go ahead and put the 4-prong drive center back in the chuck. This is where doing this method is a little faster because I don't have to keep taking this on and off. Just make sure that that's completely seated. You can spin it by hand to make sure everything's running true. If it's crooked at all and you didn't seat it in there properly, that tip would be wobbling as you turn that around. The same thing as far as finding center. Rough eyeball, that's pretty close. That's a little off there. I'm going to move that. Okay, and that looks good. One other consideration as far as the hat material goes, I like to have the hat obviously be bigger or wider here than the body, so you want to make sure that your hat is the right proportion for what you think looks good. So this piece will give me a nice looking hat by the time I turn it around, and we'll be happy with that. So gonna move my finishes out of the way. Now that we've got our center points, I'm gonna bring this up here and bring up my tailstock as well. And you don't have to get crazy tight with this either, because all we're doing is just mounting this up enough to where I can turn a tenon for the chuck. Alright, so I've brought my tailstock up, make sure it's tight, not overly snug. Snug up the quill, bring up your tool rest, make sure it clears. Once everything clears there, we can go ahead and turn this on. We'll get our spindle rough and gouge out, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing we did with the body. We're going to turn this down enough to where we can then get a tenon and mount it in the chuck so we have a little more secure fit. The other thing too is whenever I start the lathe with a square piece on it, I always stand off to the side. You want to get to a point where that's kind of subconscious. You never want to start the lathe with a piece where usually the startup is where a piece is going to come off if it's going to. That's a good way to tell, obviously, if you had your piece mounted correctly. Anytime you start the lathe, just stand out of the way. Just same thing with your grinder. Always start things out of the way in case something comes off. We got our spindle rough and gouge out. Again, I've got the handle low. I've got the flute over about 1 o'clock. And we're going to slowly start roughing these corners off. If you get too aggressive, they tend to dig in a little bit. So I'm using very light pressure. I don't even have my hand on here. You can see I'm just using just a little bit of pressure. I have it anchored against my body so it's nice and secure. And we're just getting rid of these corners to where we can make our tenon. I'm going to actually I'll remove these a little bit further. Again, you always want to work downhill with your spindle rough and gouge. You want to start from the biggest diameter, work towards the end. The nice thing about that spindle rough and gouge is it removes a lot of material really quickly. I can bring my tool rest in a little bit. Obviously stop the lathe for safety's sake if you need to. But now we can go ahead and do the same peel cut we did earlier with the skew. So I start with the handle low, ride the bevel, and then I'm going to raise the handle and make that cut. My speed was just a little bit slower than I wanted. It wasn't cutting efficiently, so I just bumped the speed back up. Part of making a tenon is I want this face here to be nice and flat, nice and square. That way the chuck jaws have a good reference face to mount off of. And then I also like to chamfer the base of the tenon as well. So you can see the peel cut's fairly clean. We've got a nice surface here. We've got a nice taper to match our chuck jaws, and then I chamfered the end there just so I don't have any sharp edges. I'm going to go ahead and remove this now, and we can put it in our chuck. You can see removing the 4-prong is a lot quicker than having to take the chuck on and off and the 4-prong out every time. And our fit on the tenon is almost the exact same as we had on the body, so that's a good looking tenon. If anything, I can make it 1/8 of an inch smaller and have a little better fit, but this will work. Obviously snug up both sides of the pinion gears. That'll give you the best hold. And for what we're going to do now is I'm going to bring up my tailstock. Because we're removing so much material off this piece and we're going down to such a small diameter, I want as much support as I can while we're removing a lot of that bulk. As soon as we get down to about 3/4 of an inch, I'll remove the tailstock, and then we'll start paring down to our final diameter of the hat. Make sure your tool rest still clears everything. You might need to adjust it in a little bit. Give it a spin. I'm going to bring this tailstock up just a little more pressure, not too much. Same thing with this. You don't need to get overly tight with this, with the quill lock or the tailstock. So this is going to be the base of the hat. So the orientation is going to be like this. So widest part of the hat here, smallest part here. The nice thing about the spindle roughing gouge is you can take really big cuts, remove a lot of material really fast. But I never want to cut uphill. If I start cutting backwards, it's going to self-feed and dig in on me. So I always want to start here and then go to the smaller diameter. If you're not comfortable with that, you can use your spindle gouge. For something this size, get your 1/2 inch. You can ride that bevel. Cuts really clean as well, but the spindle roughing gouge is just quicker. You can see that really cool ribbon we just got there. It's kind of a cool piece with a spindle roughing gouge to get a ribbon like that. When you're cutting on a big taper like this, you want to make sure that the bevel of the spindle roughing gouge is riding on there, or else it will skate back on you and catch. So I'm starting with the bevel. The cutting edge isn't touching right now, it's just the bevel. You can see how it's getting shiny, that's bevel contact. And then I rotate the handle a little bit to where it starts cutting, and then I can work that down. You can see the ribbons we're getting off of the myrtle. It cuts really well, and it's a fun fact is my grandpa Dale, actually, myrtle was his favorite wood to turn. Back when I was younger, I always wondered why, but until I started turning a lot of this stuff, and it cuts really clean. It's got a nice aroma to it. It's similar to maple, but I think it's a little bit harder, but it cuts really well and it's got good color. So I can see I can feel a flat spot on here, so I'm going to go until it's round. I don't want to go past round because I want to have as big of a hat as I can, because this body's fairly large, so I want a nice big hat to go put on there. So I can feel just a little bit of a flat spot still. Still a little bit there. That's pretty close. I think we've got about a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch wide flat spot. Yep. But you can see with the spindle roughing gouge, when you're riding that bevel down, it gives you a really clean cut surface because all the fibers you're cutting are supported by the fibers underneath. So it cuts really clean, and you can see just how quickly the material was able to be removed as well. So I'm going to turn this down until it's just round, and that's going to be my finished outside diameter of the base of the hat. Right now I don't want to turn this down too skinny here because it won't give me the support I need to remove the material. And it'll chatter a lot if I do that too much right now. Again, anytime you're working by your chuck, you want to be very careful with your cuts. Having a tool catch a chuck jaw is really exciting and is very dangerous, so you don't want to do that. The other thing too is with this hat profile, I want to maintain as much of the length of this block as I have available to me. Keep in mind I will have to have a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch long tenon to mount into the body. So this is going to be my tenon width. This is going to be the width of the rim of the hat. You can see it's about the same. It's about 1/8 of an inch. And then we're going to turn the rest of this as a nice cone taper. I'm going to get my parting tool here and part down the end of that to where I know the bottom of the tenon is going to be. And again, we're working really close to our chuck, so we want to be careful. I parted that down just to give me a visual reference of where I'm at. And then I'm going to use my skew as a peel cut here to remove some of this piece down just a little bit and give me some more working room. I think the edge on that's pretty much gone. That's a little too wide. Alright, so now that I know my tenon diameter, I'm going to part that down to roughly 1.5 inches just so it's out of the way, and then we can start working on our hat shape. This is a beading and parting tool. This gives me a really good tool to remove a lot of material, have a nice square edge. The other thing with this hat is I want to concave the underside of it, so I will use my spindle gouge, my 3/8. I'm going to work in here and try and remove some of that material to where it is a little bit concave towards the top. I want to be very careful. Obviously my tool is really close to the chuck, so I want to make sure that that's out of the way. Make sure you're very careful when you're making this cut. So now I can feel I've got a nice concave hat there. If you want to, you can make it just flat across the top as well. So again, I'm going to start on the bevel and start getting the profile of the hat that I want. I'm looking at the horizon here to see what my profile is. Whatever you like, whatever looks good to you is going to be a good shape. There's no exact perfect size or anything you have to have there. So. Okay, I think it's a little heavy right here, so I'm going to remove some more material. If you need to, you can go to your spindle gouge, start on the bevel with that flute over, slightly closed. And then you can ride that bevel down and thin out that hat just a little bit. You want to be fairly careful when you're working right here now because we don't have a lot of material to remove if you do have a catch. If I have a catch now, it's going to probably dig in deep enough to where I won't be able to get rid of it. So you want to be fairly careful as you're riding that cut around. Alright, I'm just going to stand back and take a look. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and remove our tailstock now and start getting our final diameter at the very end of the hat, and then start working our way back. If I get my final diameter here, it's going to be too skinny and it's not going to support the cutting I need to do out towards the tailstock. So you want to start out at the smallest area and then work your way back. I'm going to adjust my tool rest as well to get me as close to the wood as possible. And then I'm going to be using my spindle gouge here because this is going to be less aggressive to the wood, so it won't flex as much and it won't chatter. One thing you can do too is if you're still using your spindle roughing gouge, you can put your fingers behind the piece and help support the wood as it's being cut. I'm not gripping it very hard at all, just enough support to where when the wood pushes away from the tool, my fingers are there to kind of push it back so it doesn't chatter. Alright, we're getting thin enough out here you can hear a little bit of chatter. So I'm going to switch to my spindle gouge because it's a little less aggressive. And that's about as small as I want to go. I'm going to drill a small hole here for the knob on top of the hat now. But as far as the hat profile goes, I really like the curve we have here. It's a good aesthetic curve. You can tell when the curve looks wrong. It's just you know where you need to remove material or what to change the shape. It looks, I'd say, a little bit heavy here. I might do a couple more cuts, but I think this is good here. So I'm going to get my 1/2 inch spindle gouge. I'm going to ride that bevel. And just remove a little more material. The hat looked just a little heavy down here in the base. And now it's looking a little heavier here. I think that looks pretty good. Got a little bit of a mark here I'm going to try and remove. And again, the cleaner surface that you have from the tool means less time sanding. So always want to try and cut as cleanly as possible, because that'll give you a more cleaner surface to start sanding from. And what I'm doing now is I'm turning the underside of the hat and giving it just a little bit of an edge. I like to have the hats have a little bit of a chamfer or rolled edge on the bottom. I think it looks a little cleaner. If you're not comfortable using your spindle gouge there, one thing you can do is you can get your skew and you could lay this flat as a negative rake scraper here. That might be a little more controllable for you if you're nervous about hitting the chuck at all. The other thing too is if you didn't get a clean cut there, you could use a radius skew or negative rake scraper, and you could go in there and clean the surface up. It won't give you as clean of a surface as a bevel riding cut with your spindle gouge, but it's a good option if you don't have the tool control yet. Again, I'm supporting this with my fingers lightly, but I'm pretty happy with that. And before I drill this out, I'm just going to square this off with my spindle gouge, just a touch. One thing we like to do when mounting the ball to the top of the hat is I'm going to actually turn a small tenon for the ball to mount into the hat. It gives you a little bit better bond instead of relying just on glue. So what we'll use, I'm gonna get my keyless chuck out again, and I'm gonna be using just a small drill bit. The size doesn't have to be exact, just small enough to where it'll fit inside the hat size that you have. So the bit size will vary for you. But this is, let's see, I think this is a 16th. And as far as the drill depth, a 1/4 inch is more than enough. Honestly, 1/8 of an inch or 3/16 will be plenty. So I'm gonna start this up and slow it down again. Bring that speed down to about 1,000. And that's all it needs to be. I drilled in there about 1/4 of an inch. That'll give me enough room for a tenon on the top of the hat. And now that we have our hat profile and we have the underside concaved a little bit and our tenon roughly sized, I'm going to go ahead and sand the outside of the hat, and then we'll finish turning our tenon down to our finished size, and then we can go ahead and sand the underside of the hat as well. So I'm going to bring my speed back up. Get my 180 grit paper out. I didn't turn the speed back up to my turning speed. Sorry, I didn't bring the lathe speed back up to my turning speed. I have this at about 1500 RPM. Again, I was turning at about 2700 RPM, so it is slower than my turning speed. Right now, if you were going to be doing texture work or coloring, this would be a great time if you want to add some colored lines with a colored marker, or if you had your texturing spiraling tool. It'd be really cool to do some decorative stuff on top of the hat. That's one of the cool things about this project in particular, is there's so many different options you could do. You could do 100 gnomes and none of them would be the exact same. So with just a little creativity, this is a really fun project, and it's cheap too because you're all basically using all scrap wood. So now that I've got this rough sanded, I'm going to go ahead and finish turning my tenon down to my finished size, which is the 1/2 inch. And because we're not remounting this, I don't have to be exact. If it's slightly under a 1/2 inch, that'll work out okay. I just want to make sure it's not proud of a 1/2 inch, or else it won't fit back into the body of the gnome. So I'm going to use my narrow parting tool here. If you have a diamond parting tool, this will make it a little bit quicker. Got a good little catch there with my parting tool because I wasn't paying attention. Alright, and before we get to our finished tenon size, I want to go ahead and get rid of that catch I had with the parting tool because it left me a nice spiral there. And as well, if you're going to do any more concave on the bottom of this, now's a great time to go in there with your spindle gouge. If you have the room for it. Yeah, we'll just square that off. I'm going to try and clean this off. Okay, let's go and get our finished tenon size out using that diamond parting tool. Be very careful when you're making this cut because there's a lot of stuff to catch on that you don't want to. If you have a set of calipers, go ahead, stop the lathe and check your tenon. I would say that's slightly proud of a 1/2 inch. You can eyeball it, obviously. If you do a lot of these, you can get fairly close to what the sizing should be. Calipers are a great way to check it. Bunch of different options out there for that. All right, now that we have our tenon sized, we can go ahead and finish sanding this piece and go ahead and put our finish on it, and then we'll part it off. I'm using that sandpaper to help me get that radius out of the underside of the hat that I want. Another thing too is you can get a marker and black the underside of the hat out to where it gives you more of a defined line and helps hide the seam of the body and the hat and the beard. I'm going to sand just the edge of the hat because I don't want a sharp edge on the hat. You never want to pick up a hat and have it feel sharp to you. Go ahead and work on through your grits. .300 or 320 to 400 is usually where I'll stop at. On this kind of a project, I don't find any real benefit to going higher than that. And again, your speed, you need to bring your speed down from your turning speed, as well as watch the friction from the paper. If you're pushing too hard, it's going to get too hot. And obviously try and keep your hands away from the chuck jaws and the chuck body. And now I'm going to grab the rag we used earlier, get that the sanding sealer mix. We're going to go ahead and just slop it on here and get a good saturated coat. And don't forget to get the underside of the hat as well. I think I've got a little bit of moisture in this piece because it looks like the sanding sealer's not penetrating right here on this ring. And I know that's not it might be a compression ring, but that myrtle with finish on it, it really pops. It's a really pretty color. Very unique. So I'm going to turn the lid back on and get a clean paper towel and try and burnish this and get this to dry really quick. And you can see the spalted maple is not anywhere near as glossy as the myrtle is with sanding sealer. I think the myrtle takes it a little bit better. We want the sheen to match the body, so we're going to go ahead and get scratch free and try and darken that up or matte it out a little bit. But I want to be careful to not get scratch free on the tenon because we will be gluing that in to the body. I also want to try and keep it out of the end of the drilled hole here because we will be gluing the ball on top of the hat. Looks pretty good. It's an interesting, like a really light colored line here. I wonder if there's moisture in the piece that's not allowing the finish to penetrate there. So now that we have this doled up to the same sheen as the body, we can go ahead and part this off now. I'll use the narrow parting tool because I don't want to shorten the tenon as much as possible. And just like we did on the body when we parted it off, I'm going to support it with one hand as I part this piece off. And there we go. There's our hat. Go ahead and test fit it. And for not using calipers, that's a pretty good fit of a hat. So now that we have our body and the hat done, we just need to turn the cap and then our nose for our gnome, and then we'll put the beard on. And then this guy will be ready. So as far as the cap goes and the nose go, you can use any material. You just want to do something maybe contrasting to what the body and the hat look like. So I think for the nose, we'll use this piece of cherry, and for the top of the hat, maybe the cocobolo might work. Let's see. That might be kind of cool. Not sure what I want to do with that. You know what, we're going to do, here's what we'll do. We'll do the hat piece and the nose out of the same piece of cherry. I think those will be pretty when they're done. So as far as the hat piece goes, we're going to be shooting for roughly a 1/2 inch ball on top of the hat, and the nose roughly the same size, maybe a little bit bigger. So just like we did the hat and the body before, I'm going to get rid of the scrap piece and throw our 4-prong drive center back in. Make sure that's seated nice and flat. And then I'll bring up my tailstock. And just eyeball the center, because we're turning these down so small from a piece this size, the center doesn't have to be exact. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just turn a small tenon just to remount this, because as we're turning the beads on these, we will be unsupported on one end. So I'm going to turn a tenon, and then we'll flip it around and put it back in the chuck. Make sure that spins and clears your chuck and the tool rest. Go ahead and snug these things up. Tool rest, tailstock, and then we can go ahead and turn our lathe on. A piece this size, we can definitely bring the speed up. We're closer to 3,000 now. We'll use that spindle roughing gouge to make this down to a round piece and get rid of all the corners. So that's all we need for a tenon for the chuck. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and put this tenon in there, and you can see we are almost close to these jaws being completely closed, and that's actually gonna give us the best fit possible. And we're gonna go ahead and snug them up now. I'll bring the the tailstock back in for support as we finish roughing this off. All right, so we got our spindle roughing gouge. We're going to start roughing this down. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to put a tenon on this end as well. And then I'm going to part this in half, because I don't want to be working this far out from the chuck unsecured from the tailstock. So I'm going to part this off to where that way we're working with just a smaller piece of wood, and then I can reuse this later as well. And before I part that off, I'm going to remove the tailstock. That way it's not captured as I part it off. And then I've got my hand just loosely around the piece that'll be coming off. And then you part it off. And because we have a tenon on there, we can reuse this later. So I'm going to move my tailstock completely out of the way. I'm going to stop the lathe and move my tool rest. I want to get this really close because we're going to be turning some really small beads with a tenon. I want to be as close to the work as I can. So make sure that clears, and we're going to go ahead and speed this up again. And I'm going to turn this down to a rough diameter of what I want the ball to be. Okay, that'll give me a good place to start. The ball center is going to be right about there, and this will be my tenon, roughly 1/8 of an inch long for the hat. When you're turning a ball or a bead this small, I'm going to use my smaller spindle roughing gouge. This is a 3/8, and I'm going to start right in the center, and then I'm going to roll the handle, raise the handle while I roll the flute closed. And as I do that, it's going to create a nice rounded profile for me. I've got some torn grain that I want to get rid of from where I parted it off. And I'm just parting down the tenon that we'll put in the hat, that way I have some room to work. And then I'm going to go ahead and remove some more material here. This will give me a little more workspace. There's a lot of movement in the tool when you're doing a bead this small. So usually when I'm working on the right edge, I'll switch to my right-handed stance. That way my body's not in the way of the tool handle doing what it needs to. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that shape. I'm going to go ahead and turn down the tenon now that's going to go into the body, or sorry, the hat. And then I'm going to finish profiling this side of the bead. I'm supporting that a little bit with my finger because that tenon is so small now. And now we're ready to sand that. If you're having trouble shaping this bead or the nose, get it close and then you can use sandpaper for a lot of the process to help refine that curve. And if this is the nose, the process is going to be the exact same for the nose. So you might find after you turn two of these, you'll like to pick one for the nose and one for the hat better. And you could do a totally different shape. It doesn't have to be a sphere. You could turn whatever shape you want, because these are just for fun, you know. I definitely want to take my time sanding here because on a round ball like this, if there's any torn fibers right in the center, it'll be really noticeable. So I want to make sure I've cut that clean and that it's sanded well. Alright, I'm going to move up in my sanding grits. And I'm not going to use scratch free on these two because I will be gluing them in. I don't want to get any wax on the tenon. So this will be just a little bit of the sanding sealer while the lathe's spinning here. I'm just going to coat that. Make sure it's completely saturated. And you can see that cherry, as soon as it gets some finish on it, cherry really pops. Then we'll go ahead and friction cure that. One thing to note is keep the drill bit that you use to drill the hat or the nose close. That way you can eyeball the size of that tenon and what it needs to be. And I can see that I was slightly proud of the diameter I need. If you overlay that, and then we're going to go ahead and part that down to the diameter that will fit. Get my drill bit back up. I'm going to use the smooth portion of it to eyeball it. If you have calipers, that's a good way to check as well. That looks like it should fit now. And now we can go ahead and part that off. And obviously you want to catch this because if that goes in your shaving pile, it's going to get lost. But you can see we got a really good finish on there. Cherry's a really pretty wood once you have finish. And we can go ahead and test the fit of our cap. So that fits really good. Because we got a concave surface here in the top of the hat when we finish turning that, as well as the cap knob, we got a really good fit. And the cherry actually pops really good on top of that myrtle. I think that looks sharp. So now we're going to use the remainder of this piece that's in the chuck to turn the nose for the gnome. And it's going to be basically the exact same process. I'm going to roll over this rounded edge here just so I don't have any sharp corners. Get my pencil. I want the nose to be a little bit bigger than the cap of the hat, so I'm going to leave this fairly large here for now. This is all going to be tenon, and then I know where my center line of the sphere and the end are. Parting that down a little ways just to give me clearance for my gouge. As I'm rolling that bead right in the bevel, then I swing the handle and drop the nose of the tool. I'm happy with the size of that. I'm just eyeballing it compared to the body. I think it could go just a little bit smaller, and then I think that'll look pretty cool. Doing perfect little beads and spheres this small, they're fairly difficult. Obviously if you need to, you can grab your spindle gouge, or your skew. So go ahead and use your skew if you need to refine your curve. The biggest thing is I want the end there to be nice and cleanly cut, because it's really hard to sand out torn end grain fibers. Now I'm going to go ahead and part that tenon down smaller so we can start sanding the bead. You can hear that chatter. That's just a really small tenon. That's a lot of force to be putting on it, so it is chattering a little ways. Alright, again, just work through your sanding grits. On the nose, you want to be really careful how you sand it, because that's going to be the first thing people notice. The front of the gnome is the nose. If there's any torn grain in the end of that, it's going to stand out like a sore thumb. So you want to make sure you take your time and sand this really well. Okay, I think that's alright. We're going to go ahead and get our sanding sealer back out. Give it a good saturating coat. Set that aside, and then we're going to get a clean piece of paper towel and go ahead and cure friction dry that. Now we can go ahead and size our tenon to make sure it fits the drilled hole we're going to put in the nose. And because I'm going to drill the hole in the face for the nose using the same bit, I'm going to eyeball the tenon for that bit. And this one I'm going to go just a little bit longer on the tenon. I'm more like 3/16 now in the length of that. Then we're going to go ahead and part that off. And that will be the nose for our gnome. So now that we have all of our pieces for the gnome, it's time to put this thing together. So I'm going to go ahead and clean off my lathe bed. Alright, so now that we have all the pieces turned, it's time to finally put these together. And for mounting the nose, I like to mount the nose fairly high on the body of this gnome. I'm going to keep it fairly high towards the hat. It doesn't have to be in any exact spot. So if you eyeball it, I'm just go ahead and get a pencil here. And I actually have, there's a small wormhole. I don't know if you can see in this piece. I'm going to drill it just below that. So go ahead and get your pencil mark out where you want to drill the nose on this piece. And that's roughly where it's going to sit. So I'm going to set that aside. And this is the bit that we sized the tenon for on the nose. And you can see we've got a good, nice fit there. And this is going to be a brad point bit. This will help me center this up before I drill it. And then try and drill that just as square as you can to the piece. I drilled it in there roughly 1/4 of an inch to give me a little more room for the tenon and some glue. And we can go ahead and test fit the nose. So we have a really good fit there. The nice thing about this is once we put the beard on, the nose looks really good. Nice matching cherry nose and hat cap. And that gnome's looking pretty good. So I'm going to set that aside. And as far as the beards go, you can use a bunch of different materials. So right now I've got this piece here. This is just some fur from a fly fishing shop. If you go to a Hobby Lobby, any of the craft stores, they have fake fur, and they'll come in a sheet. And the nice thing about them coming on this sheet like this is the hair is sewn to it. So when you go to glue it on, all you have to do is cut out the shape of the beard, and then you can glue the entire piece on, and it'll all stay together. So this stuff comes in about a 5x8 sheet. It's pretty cheap, but there's a ton of different colors. So you have the good gray color. There's black. The fly shops have some really cool colors, like they have this, like a fox fur or some other lighter fur, and then some green. So play around with the color of the beard depending on the woods you chose. Different colors of beards will look better. I think those are too similar, so I'm going to skip the red. I think the black's not a great choice for that one. The gray looks okay. The tan, obviously, I'm going to stick away from because it's the same color as the wood. But I think the gray would look pretty sharp on there. It's very similar to the color palette we had on this. I think the gray will look pretty good. The nice thing too about getting the fur in sheets like this is it allows you to get some really long hairs on there and gives the piece some good life to it. Makes it look a lot more realistic, I guess, for a wood-turned gnome. Gives it some more fun color to it and shape. So we'll be using the gray color on this beard. I'm going to set those aside. And you can see I've already used this one for a couple of these sample pieces. But what I'm going to do for this size, I'm just going to roughly lay this out to where I see how wide I want to go with the beard. And because this is a larger body, I'm probably going to go with about a 2 to 3 inch wide strip. I'm going to cut that just square across. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut this out. This will give me a nice chunk to start working with. As soon as you start cutting into the fur, it's going to shed whatever's not attached anymore. So you're going to want to go ahead and pull a lot of those loose fibers off. Alright, so now that we have our rough piece of beard, we're going to go ahead and lay out where we need to cut this to fit it to our gnome. So draw a line right down the center, and we're going to cut a small slit which will wrap around the nose of the gnome. And then I've found that once we start wrapping it, it starts to pull this, and so I like to radius the top edge. So I'm going to be removing this corner and this corner here as well. So I'm going to give this more of like a tombstone type profile to it. So square on the sides and then radius up towards the top. So we'll do that, and then I'm going to go ahead and kind of part the beard in the middle where we're going to be cutting down the center. That way I don't cut off any hair. And then I'm going to cut that about 3/4 of an inch deep in the middle. That'll allow us to wrap the hair around the nose to where you don't see the seam. And I'm going to take the hat off while we test fit the beard. Set that aside. That's going to give us room to work and try and test fit the beard. So I like to grab one side of this and go underneath the nose. Then I grab the other side and then I swing that up and around. That gives you a little better looking beard once it's glued on. So I think our fit is good. We've got a good fit around the nose. I think that looks pretty sharp. So now that we've got a good test fit, I'm going to go ahead and start gluing this on. And this is going to be kind of hard to capture what's actually happening because there's a lot of fitting, moving, and adjusting while we do this. So the first thing first is I'm going to put just a little bit of glue on this side and this side of the nose, and we're going to glue the very top of the beard to the body first. So I'm going to go ahead and put just a small layer of glue around the nose on both sides. And I'm going to hit this with a little bit of activator, and we've got to work fairly quick. So I'm going to grab the beard and start tucking this up around the nose. And then you want to work, get something pointy, and use the back of the drill bit and just try and tuck the hair in around the nose so you don't have a seam. Trying to remove any of the excess hair that's loose. I'm going to move this guy out of the way. But when I go to look at the fit of this, I can see it's just a little loose. Well, actually, it's a pretty good fit right there. So I'm slightly proud of the top of the wood. So I'm going to use the scissors to trim off any extra material around the top of the piece. That way the hat sits flush. And now that we have our beard anchored to the body, we can go ahead and start gluing the rest of the fur patch down here. So I'm going to peel that back, and I'm going to go ahead and grab my glue bottle and just do a nice thin layer across the front of the body here. And I'll hit that with some activator, and then we'll go ahead and lay our fur down and just kind of hold it in place for a second as that glue is curing. So now that we've got most of it glued down, then we can go back in and get just the very bottom trim piece. And I'm going to go straight onto the fur patch here. Hit that with some activator, and then we'll lay that down the rest of the way. So I'm just going to hold that in place while that glue is curing. And then you can go ahead and remove any of the hair that's loose. And the fun thing is too, is when you're working with CA glue and a bunch of fake fur, you get a ton of it glued to your fingers. And you can see I've got just a little bit that didn't get glued on the edges, so I'm going to go ahead and glue those pieces down so they're not sticking up on me. And then just give those some pressure as that glue's drying. Okay, now that we have our beard looks really good. It's nice and flowy, nice and long, so that way when it sits on the table, the hair kind of lays out, makes it look a little more realistic and fun. Go ahead and test fit the hat and make sure it seats correctly. Sometimes if the hair is too proud of the wood here, the hat won't seat all the way, but that looks pretty good. So our gnome's looking really good. So we can go ahead and glue the hat on now. I'm going to get the same glue we've been using. I'm going to go ahead and put just a small bead on the inside edge. Hit it with some activator. And real quick, you can line up the hat grain in any particular direction if you have some different woods that would look better. Go ahead and test it out. And now we can go ahead and glue on the cap. So with this one, I want to be very careful. I'm just going to put just the teeniest, tiniest amount onto the tenon. And then we're going to go ahead and let that cure up. But that is our finished gnome. So we've got a nice cherry cap and nose, we've got a myrtle hat, and then some spalted maple for the body. But that is a fun little Christmas gnome. Really cool project. If you play around with different colors of material, sizes, different beards, you could go with a mustache, different colors, texturing. Really, really fun project. The other cool thing is it's really scalable. You can go to an ornament size or you can go to a tabletop type. And after you turn a few of these, you can have a really cool little tabletop collection. It's a really fun project. Go ahead and play around with different styles, colors, and sizes. But after you turn a few, go ahead and tag us on social media and we can see what you've turned. If you found the video helpful, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.